Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Podcast powered by First National. I'm Aaron, he's Adam. We're recording live at the Toronto Real Estate Forum, day one of the Toronto Real Estate Forum. As sitting here as part of our speaker video series, I'd like to thank our sponsors, CGI and Doust Vukovic. Our guest today is an individual of the name Thomas Mueller, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Green Building Council. Thank you, Thomas, for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Well, you know what? I'm in Canada longer now than I lived in Germany. I came to Canada in 1988, actually here into Toronto, Kitchener-Waterloo, did my degree in planning there. And at that time, sustainability was around that time, and sustainability was still unknown. It was called sustainable development. It was this report that came out by the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future. A lot of people don't remember that report, but that set the ground rules for sustainable development. And we didn't really know what that meant because it brought the ESG, basically economy, society, and the environment together. And that these three things need to work together for us to have economic prosperity, health, and a healthy environment as well, of course. It took us about 20 years to work it out what that actually means in more practical terms. So I finished my master's in planning at the University of Waterloo, and then there was the big recession here. And I found
a very big recession here, I believe. I'm surprised you didn't go back to Germany, or was it going on in Germany too?
I was thinking about it, but Canada is a really good place to live. So I went out to Vancouver and I found a job there, and I worked at Metro Vancouver, which is kind of a regional level of government, but it's not really government; it's more like a utility provider. And there we had the ability to develop some of the first sustainability programs on a regional basis, and buildings were actually a really important part of that. So that's where late 1990s, where the interest in buildings started to grow and the building sector started to grow. So we did quite a fair amount of work, seminal work at Metro Vancouver at the time, developing policies and programs around green buildings. And that's when the LEED building rating system came in. So Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design rating system came in. For the first time, it defined what do we actually talk about environment in the building sector, right? And so...
what year was this, do you think?
That was around the late 1990s, 1998, 1999. Okay. And we started to adopt LEED, so LEED certification for buildings in the early 2000s. Started in British Columbia. It started with government, and then it really went across the country because governments thought, hey, this is a great opportunity to walk the talk. We can green our buildings. We still have savings on operating costs because energy efficiency was a great concept then. It's still a concept now. And so we started to put some of these policies in, work with the city of Vancouver, work with some of the big utilities at the time, the provincial government, and it just went across the country. And then in the early 2000s, the Canada Green Building Council was created. And it was created by industry leaders at the time, and it was mainly from the design community, like architects and engineers. They wanted to see a change, and I joined the board. And then about 2 years later, I became the CEO, president and CEO. Left a very good position in the government to start working out of my garage with 3 people employed. But it was the right decision to make because you fast forward now. Canada Green Building Council has been very successful in bringing sustainability to the building sector. So we should really talk about the E today, not the S and the G. I'm really interested in the E. That's really what the strength is of the Canada Green Building Council. So we brought that in, and we were able to galvanize and engage the whole supply chain in the building industry to bring that change to Canada. And Canada is now considered, when it comes to green building and decarbonization, is actually considered to be a global leader in the world. And the commercial real estate sector started coming in around 2010, and then it came in a massive way. You cannot go to any city in Canada, in the downtown area, where not all the office buildings have LEED certification.
Who are your core members of the council? I mean, talk about the architects and the designers, but who are the ultimate members that form part of your group?
The core members are, again, we represent the entire supply chain. So we do have architectural firms, we have engineering firms, we have manufacturers, suppliers, big contractors like Ellis Don, Pomelo, PCL. And then I would say most of the large commercial real estate firms are members of the council as well. So that includes, Oxford Properties, it includes Cadillac, Fairview, and, both pension funds and REITs that have joined the council because we bring value to that sector in terms of, advanced standards, and then we support the sector in achieving those standards and add value to the business.
I mean, I got to say that I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that Canada's leading the way in this front. We had a guest on yesterday at the Global Property Market Conference named Jose Pellicer, and he was talking about the regulatory framework in Europe, where every building has a scoring system, and if you're not meeting a certain standard, your building won't be able to be tenanted by tenants. It won't be able to be financed.
Well, I can maybe speak to that with more authority, having grown up in Europe, and I've lived there close for 30 years. I would say in Europe, because of the European Union, everything is regulatory driven, right? And they also have, I would say, generally speaking, don't have the resources, like particularly when you think about energy and other resources that we have in North America or that we have in Canada, right? So in Canada and North America, we just take more of a business-focused approach. So most of it's very interesting because until very recently, when regulation really started to kick up, particularly driven by municipalities, a little provincial as well, it was very voluntary driven. Actually, it was driven by business objectives. And our goal as the council, and because we're very much industry-led, we are non-profit, but we're industry-led, was always on how does this work on a business side? What's the business case? What's my return on investment? So it's always been driven by that. And I would say the success, we have like 6,000 certified LEED buildings in Canada now, is driven by, actually, when I do this, I'm going to have a positive bottom line. And in commercial real estate, it either means operating savings, tenants, rents. There's all kinds of benefits to be had for that sector.
So one of the challenges we've talked about this on this podcast before, and we've had guests on that to debate this is, well, the larger institutions have motivations, right? Because they have an impact investment thesis. They have environmental or ESG committees. Their yield, their capital attraction is based on these things, and often I think at times they're attracting capital because they have these sort of green initiatives built into their distribution platform. Part of the challenge, of course, though, is that those major institutions only make up about 20% of total real estate ownership in the country, maybe less. I'm not exactly sure, but it's not a huge amount. The other 80% are the much smaller owner operators, the private institutions. There are who just don't have that same motivation, that same incentive to really buy in, to spend that money. And of course, there's a low-hanging fruit. And if it's driving NOI, I think anybody that's got owns a piece of real estate understands that math. And so the aerator faucets, the low flow toilets, the LED lighting, like all the stuff that's easy that you can kind of squeeze some efficiency out of course, those things are occurring. But when it becomes more macro, whether that's conversions of your heating source or solar panel investments or building envelope, whatever it may be, it becomes, really difficult for them to see the light, for why that investment, it makes sense. And, so then of course the question becomes, how do you get those people to convert, let's say, of course. And then we were talking about the European Union and Jose Pellicer, who we had on yesterday. And for the listeners that haven't either listened to that episode or perhaps it's not out yet, ultimately what he was describing is where the European Union has created an infrastructure where all buildings, single family, multifamily, commercial, get a objective scoring on their carbon footprint or their energy efficiency. And that scoring then drives a bunch of, regulation. And so even single family homes have this. And what it looks like is it's sort of an A, B, C, or D. And depending on your scoring, you are prevented from doing certain things. And the big one that I think is really interesting, where this is where it's the stick versus the carrot, where in 2029, by 2029, the European Union has mandated that if you have a certain score, which is a scoring of D, which I believe is one of the lowest scores, if not the lowest score, you can no longer lease that building. And these scoring, like these things are very transparent. Like if you're listing a building for sale or buying a building, it's there. If you're leasing a building, obviously it's there. So everybody knows what the building scores are. And so if you own a building that has a low score, it's going to have material impact on you, whether it's a duplex, a 1 million square foot industrial building, a 30-story office building. It's all the same. You're going to be impacted. What do you think about that, Thomas? And what are your comments?
So it's a double question.
Sure, yeah, you go. Yeah, well, it's lots of questions. I don't know. You take it with what you want from what I just my rambling.
Well, you read your stuff, so that I like that. Well, in terms of in Europe, that's what's happening right now. You have the European Union with the member countries, and they're driving the EU directives down the middle in terms of reducing the output from the building sector. I mean, globally, when you look at it, building sector globally now, from the UN, the COP meetings that happen annually, the building sector since 2016, 2018, the building sector is now on the map.
Well, let's acknowledge, the contribution of the commercial real estate community or commercial real estate buildings to climate change and the production of carbon. I mean, the embodiment of carbon in our buildings and just the general output has a huge impact. Yeah, 30%.
Everything in it is about 30% operational emissions and embodied. The materials that you use, the cement, the concrete, the steel that you use. So it's massive. So there's a focus on it now because the policymakers, both international and domestic, understand without the building sector decarbonizing, we can reach our climate change goals, period, right? So it will be a combination of industry leadership and of regulation coming in, particularly at the municipal level and potentially at the provincial.
You don't see it happening at the federal level. I mean, that's how they do it at Europe, where there's sort of this macro overarching regulations that's being pushed down onto the building owner operators.
But federally, we are a federated country. So when it comes to energy and building codes and so on, it's the responsibility of the provinces and territories, right? And then it's the cities, and depending on the city, City of Vancouver, for example, has more regulatory powers because it has a charter. It's a chartered city. So it depends. But this system that you see coming now, there will be regulation, and the regulation is already ramping up. When you look at the City of Vancouver, the regulation is now existing buildings of a certain size, you need to meet a certain performance target around carbon intensity target. And if you don't meet that target by 2026, first you have to report it next year. By 2026, if you don't meet that target, you have to pay a penalty to the City of Vancouver, similar to the model that already exists in New York. So some cities are starting to pursue that. And performance certificates, performance targets in buildings, rather than kind of relative performance improvements, that is the direction that most regulators are going into because it's more measurable, right? It's clearer how many greenhouse gas emissions per square meter, kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per square meter per year. That's what's important. So we think this is going to happen to varying degrees, depending on politics. But what we really think is that the industry, both large and small, actually has an opportunity to lead this because it's already been leading it with LEED certifications, right? And I mean, you have it very broad on LEED certification, 6,000 buildings. We're the third largest country in the world after the US and China in terms of the number of LEED buildings in the world, right? So, and China has like 200 times the population that we have. So it's really an opportunity for the industry to lead. So we are at this real estate forum, we're releasing a report with RealPAC on how the real estate sector can actually decarbonize, large and small, identifying the barriers, identifying the recommendations, and how industry, government, and the utilities actually have to work together to make that happen. So there's in my opinion, there's a real leadership opportunity for the commercial real estate sector to actually set the agenda, control the agenda, rather than to wait for regulation to come in.
Forgive my ignorance, but it's LEED Platinum, LEED Gold, Silver, and then does it go down that
No,
far?
bronze.
Okay,
Certified,
no bronze.
certified.
So
We got rid of bronze some time ago.
So in the modern context, then, if people are building marketable buildings, are they pursuing LEED Silver, or is it just the higher rankings that they'd be chasing at this point? Spectrum.
In the private sector, nobody's doing silver or certified anymore. It's all gold or platinum. It's definitely a drive to platinum. And the next stage is now where we see increasingly led by companies like KingSett, Cadillac Fairview, that are going now either new building or existing buildings have LEED certification, converting them now to zero carbon operational carbon. So zero carbon certification. There's another certification we provide. It's a made in Canada, whereas LEED is a global standard, right? Coming out of the US. So it is definitely seen now this progression of knowledge is being gained through LEED certification to really saying, okay, the next challenge that we have, and actually Paul Morosetti said it this morning, is decarbonization has to become a part of the business model. If you think you want it or not, I think hesitation on that issue now or complacency on the issue now is going to make for any building owner life more difficult down the road, because the climb to either retrofit existing buildings is just going to become more expensive and more difficult to meet the objectives in terms of decarbonization. And for new buildings, if you listen to Paul and to people like Guy Granger from JLL, who spoke at our conference this year, is there's an increasing market gap of about 70% by 2030 in demand for zero or net zero office space in Canada. So this is not only a regulatory kind of requirement and to go in that direction, but it's also a significant business opportunity to go in that direction that's currently not being met.
Office. So I can see the relationship with office and how, an office user, an office occupier benefits and can justify the value and perhaps paying a little bit more. Certainly I think the employees will drive a bit of it, that they want their employer to be focused on energy efficiency and carbon neutrality. I think often the shareholders, the owners of the buildings, of the entities that are occupiers, perhaps they've got, a demand for it, or they have sort of an impact investment requirements or an ESG policies, and so renting and leasing from an office building that has platinum, LEED platinum, there's some value there. I start to lose that relationship when I think about industrial. Now industrial, I can still see it there. It's a much simpler building. There's, I think, still some real value for those LEED Platinum certifications. I can see how the occupiers of that space could drive some value, could attach value to it, and perhaps pay a little bit of a premium to it. But it really starts to break down when I think about retail and apartments, where the end user, and retail is more difficult because you think about a clothing store that decides they're only going to lease from or have tenancy in carbon neutral buildings or LEED platinum. I'm not sure their consumers, you, me, and Thomas, are going to pay more or going to drive out of our way to go to a retailer because they've made that stance. Like, I just don't see the relationship between the consumer and the upselling necessary. Like, I'm not paying more because of that. And then it's the same thing with apartments. My sense is that somebody's not leaving their apartment unit and going across the street and paying an extra $100 a month in rent because one building has a LEED platinum or is more carbon neutral than the other one. I lose the relationship, and it needs probably more of a community driver to make some of this change. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right. I think office and industrial is even in our numbers, like when we have about shy of 500 zero carbon projects now in Canada, top number in new buildings is industrial.
Right.
Second is
It's also easier because it's just sort of four walls and a ceiling.
yeah, exactly. And then
yeah.
you have a roof surface. You can put some solar on there or something like that. The second one is community centers. The third one,
which is municipal driven.
yeah, municipal, and the
Yeah.
third
They're
one
not
is
yield driven, yeah.
Yeah.
and the third one is multi-unit residential.
Really?
Yeah, that's an interesting. That surprised us a little bit too. But as our standards have evolved, we have made it more accessible to the residential sector. But the fact is, I don't disagree with you, right? There are certain sectors that are harder to decarbonize. Retail is one where we haven't made a lot of progress, to be quite honest. Right? It's been very difficult just because of the tenant structure.
So Aaron and I are not engineers, but can you describe what you'd be putting in place to pursue a carbon neutral building today?
It depends, right? If you have a new building, you basically, and let me put it this way. It depends. First of all, what type of building is it and where is it located, right? If you're in British Columbia or Quebec, you naturally would choose electrification. We get our electricity from hydro. It's 95% carbon free, right? So there's a strategic advantage for Canada. Quebec will build out its hydro capacity. BC Hydro is bringing on new levels of mid-side sea dam. And even in Ontario, I mean, Premier Ford announced that they're going to electrify the province, right? They're going to use some a combination, but bring back nuclear. So electrification is really part of the economy of the future, right? And buildings that are being built today that connect to being electrified, heat pumps, geo-exchange systems, so ground source heat. That's the way to go, particularly geo-exchanges for larger projects. You can also do it in individual buildings. Valhalla Village did it, so they have a geo-exchange system. So from a just an energy source perspective, it's electrification, right? Do we have all the supply that we need? No. How can we need more supply? But we also need higher levels of efficiency, right, in buildings. We cannot use electricity the same way we use natural gas, that we just, whatever it takes, right? So we have to make improving levels of efficiency. So you use that, and then you use a combination of better technology, better equipment, but then also better building envelopes, right? So the building envelope, particularly in a climate like ours, where it can get very cold and very hot within the course of a year, building envelopes, they need to be constructed to be more efficient, right? So better insulation, higher performing building envelopes. If you have this combination for new buildings, that's your winner, essentially, right? Existing buildings is a little bit different. Existing buildings, you would actually, replacing the envelope is expensive. So really in existing buildings, you have to focus on equipment and making those changes over time aligned with your investment cycle.
Let's go to the condo developers and let's ignore the current condo market. You had mentioned the apartment operators being third on your list, and that kind of surprised me. But I guess I can see how there's, long-term plays, and the owner operators of these apartment buildings have, often looking at 15, 20-year IRRs, and so can see their way through the value and the return on those investments for energy efficiencies. Condo developers, it's kind of a quick and dirty. They're in and out. Like, they have no real incentive. What do you think?
There's no incentive.
It's sort of like it's in and out as quickly as
taking
possible.
a bite out of profits.
It's like this is the condo market is, in terms of decarbonization and sustainability in general, it's just the worst.
Dirty words.
It's
Because
the word.
buyers
It's the
don't
word.
care about
It's
it? Is
like
that the-
carbon is a 6-letter word, right? I mean, because of the split incentive, right? They don't have no incentive. And if you go to the residential market developers and saying, why are you not building to that? And say, well, I would do it if the consumer asks for it, right? It's the typical chicken and egg thing.
Which is the same thing we were talking about with apartments and not paying more for rent, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. So, to be honest, I
that
wish
one,
there was.
you need a stick for that. There's no
yeah,
carrot.
you need a
There's no
stick.
carrot
I
there.
wish there was I'm not a regulated type of guy, but that sector needs to be regulated,
Right.
right? And it needs to be regulated progressively. But we have to be careful, because otherwise the industries that are happening right now are pushing back against regulations. That's going too fast, it's costing too much, and so on. I would.
They're not building right now anyway. Isn't
Yeah,
now
yeah.
the time to slap all that on?
But you know what? I would disagree with that.
Anyway, yeah.
If you look, actually, everything that takes to build a condo these days, the greening stuff is just such a small component of the
Right.
overall cost. Land holding costs, development fees, permit, like how long you have to wait to even get your approvals. It's not the green stuff. It's all the other stuff. Everybody, municipalities, everybody wants more development fees and so on and so on. And you know, if you wait 5 to 7 years to get a project approved, it's a ridiculous amount of time. And then you say, well, it's the green stuff. It's not the green stuff.
Yeah,
The green stuff is just, then when you finally get your permit, you want to go as fast as humanly possible, get the project built and sold. That's the culprit. And the other culprit is that the residential developers never really got into really understanding what's required to do it. They always kind of fought back in a way, but there's some enlightened ones. You have here Tridel, they build a lot of buildings to lead. You have Minto, you have Mattamy, and on the West Coast, you have West Bank. These are all companies that have starting to work out the business model around this and building to that level. So there are companies that are doing it because they said, this is coming, this needs to be part of our business model, and they're building that way.
Yeah.
But it's not the majority.
So let's I'm going to apologize in advance for a little bit of this, but let's nerd out a little bit on geosourcing. You raised it as a great way for operator owners to sort of invest in sort of the carbon reduction on their buildings, and it is from a energy usage. It's effectively almost exclusively free, right? Because it's heat sourcing and cooling from the ground. I don't think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there's a whole community industry that's been growing over the last number of years, where it's third-party owner-operators of this geotech, where they partner with developers, and during the development, they get in there as one of the verticals and drill the holes, install all the material, all the infrastructure, and then throughout the build, they're there kind of making sure that everything's sort of connected. They've got the heat pumps, and then once developed, they end up operating that geosource system, that geothermal system, owning and operating that system for typically what is a 30-year lease. And so they're leasing that material back to the developer, or in the case of condos, where it's been really successful, back to the condo board and the condo owners. Now, of course, the condo market has stopped. And so that community that have been very successful on this third-party owner operation of geothermal installations for large towers has pivoted to the apartment market. The challenge we're having right now in that apartment market is, me as lenders and my insurer, CMHC, for apartment buildings, don't like having part of the infrastructure of that building owned and operated by a third party. I mean, it's no different than if, let's say, they had outsourced somehow the operations and ownership of the elevator, vertical, and the apartment owners don't own the elevator towers. Like, that would be a real challenge for us from ultimately from a marketability perspective. When we take security, when we register mortgages on title, we want to have unfettered control over that building, meaning we want to be able to take back the building in the event of default, and the necessity of having working out a claim or working out a distressed asset to be able to have unfettered control. And so third party ownership is a real challenge. We and of course the problem is a lot of the developers, I think, rightfully see geothermal as a great way to invest in their buildings, and a great way to invest towards more carbon neutrality. Because it as you've alluded to, it can be very inexpensive. The challenge, of course, is it costs a lot to install, and we don't necessarily have the expertise. And enter these third parties, Enbridge, Enwave, Subterra, and many others who are offering this service to the developers. The challenge we're having, of course, as a community, is trying to figure out how we can get comfortable not having total security over that building, and making sure that ultimately at the end of the day that energy cost, because you've got to pay that lease back to that third party now, is consistent over time and doesn't skew against what would be traditional heating and cooling costs, aka sort of electricity off the grid and or gas. Were you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of this big, specific example that you gave, but it doesn't surprise me. Like there's always, over the last 20 years, as we progressed on integrating green buildings into all different sectors of the building industry, there are always barriers. I just had meetings with insurance companies. They basically say, for them, resiliency of buildings is a huge issue now because of flooding, air quality, wildfires, those types of things. But they still don't know how to assess that risk, right? And how do you then transfer that risk and how buildings have to be built? And does it align with green building practices? It's not the same, right? So I think where we are at in this kind of like what you described is, how can we take green buildings, and in this case, GeoExchange, how can we take that to scales? And of course, the barriers. The barriers from an insurer point of view, the barriers in terms of obviously you have a third party. You as a lender financing, that's a concern. The GeoExchange systems that have been installed in Canada, I never heard there's been any problem with it, ever. And we have many buildings where in our program where GeoExchange has been used as far as 10, 15 years ago. It's a very steady supply of energy to the building. It's not exposed to things like, wind, for example, like storms or flooding, because it's underground. Like electricity has vulnerability, it's above ground. Natural gas probably less so, but I've never heard that a system failed or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I think it's the way to go.
It's education.
It's education, and I think it's education for the lenders. It's education for the developers, but it's a great way to have the system put in place and not having to pay, basically take it off your books and have somebody else do it. And the contract, as you said, is with the tenants. I don't quite frankly think the tenants or the buyers, they don't care. To be quite honest, they don't care. They just want the service.
Yeah.
Right? They want the service. And once the system has been paid off, actually the cost of you heating and cooling that building just drops significantly.
I'd be remiss to not mention that, First National and other partners, all the other third-party owner-operators of the geothermal technology, we have been actively advocating and lobbying for with CMHC to have them sort of form policy that allows them to get more comfortable. As much as I understand the risk, if my insurer is okay with it, then of course I am.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, exactly.
That's how you approach risk area.
Well, so government and government agency do have a role to play.
And I do need to give a shout out to Lucy Anlauer of Subterra, who's been actively educating CMHC. And, I want to put that out there because, when this episode comes out, I'm not sure when that's going to be in the future. There's a chance that CMHC has changed their policies, and I want to make sure that I've kind of hedged my bet, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, it is. Geothermal is definitely for larger developments and larger buildings. It's the way of the future. There's no doubt about it. GeoExchange, heat pumps, better envelopes, using electricity. That's the way to go. Will we still use natural gas? Of course we will. The transition is not going to happen as fast as we think it's going to happen. Because we locked into an energy system and an infrastructure. We invested trillions of dollars over the ages. That's not going to just disband it, but it's going to be transitioning out, because the consequences of not doing that, which we're already starting to feel, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So we have to do both now, adapt and mitigate at the same time.
We're running out of time, unfortunately, but I've got one more question, if that's okay. And I want to ask about just the challenge we've got, the obstacle we have with embodied carbon, and it forms a big component of the contribution that the commercial real estate contributes to the environment and to global warming. And I'm just really curious what your comments are just about how we manage that.
I would say, we, the council, we had an embodied carbon summit this year at our conference. We're going to have another one where we brought all the parties together to discuss the path forward for embodied carbon and what needs to happen. both from a policy point of view, but also from a production point of view and application point of view. So those different three things. I think the best thing your industry can do is to ask for product that has a lower carbon footprint. Particularly when we're talking really about cement and steel, right? The structural materials. There's increasing knowledge also on MEP, like mechanical systems, but we still have a ways to go there. But cement and steel, and then massive timber. Those are the three areas, right? So what the industry can do, ask the cement industry for products that have a lower carbon footprint. We lowered our standards, actually, not lowered in the means make it easier and make it a little bit harder on embodied carbon, because all the projects has achieved the 10% embodied carbon target. So now we lowered it. We're not a percentage anymore. We have a target of kilograms per square meter per year, per square meter, not per year, per square meter. That's based on the feedback we got from the industry. So we are starting to move the target down and getting more ambitious about embodied carbon as the industry provides product. But the industry has to ask for it because the manufacturers want to provide it. The federal government asks for it already for their projects. They won't accept cement that at least doesn't have 10% less carbon. They want to move to 30 over the next few years, 30% less, right? So I think that's definitely the way to go on the embodied carbon side. On the mass timber side, everybody, we build with mass timber. Wood sequesters carbon. But the sweet spot for mass timber buildings is 10 to 12 stories. It's not 30 stories and not 40 stories. They're being built, yes. But why are you building those buildings? Because we can. Can they be replicated? Maybe in a couple of decades, but right now 10 to 12 stories. There's a lot happening around mass timber production in Canada, prefabrication, modular building. It's all happening with mass timber. So we do see investment and more activity in that part of the industry. I would say, and I don't want to say this with, overconfidence, but right now, because it's still fairly new, I would say these buildings do cost more, right? Again, it's the value that you're looking for. But I would say mass timber up to 10, 12 stories, and then decarbonized cement and steel for larger buildings. And the cement industry knows that. They're starting to build facilities, not in North America yet, but in Europe. Holcim's building a new plant where they're going to basically provide zero carbon concrete to the industry in Europe. So the cement industry knows, because it has such a large carbon footprint, on how to decarbonize. And we can just do a podcast around that, all the different strategies that they are using to decarbonize cement. It's not just the fuel source, it's the application, how much cement you actually need in a building, how to apply it, using cement replacing materials in concrete. There's a whole range of technical changes they're going to make to cement making. They will lower the carbon footprint of concrete, and we are on our way, but it's going to take time.
Thomas, thanks so much for coming on. It was a good conversation, but we are out of time, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a good conversation, and you can tell that it's a big field now that this industry here is moving progressively towards addressing the E in the ESG, and we're working with them. Yeah.
I want to thank Dow Vukovic and CGI for sponsoring our speaker video series here at the Toronto Real Estate Forum. First National, of course, for powering the podcast, and most of all, Thomas, thanks for spending time with us today.